Now I'd like to turn to Paul Hilton, who's got the incredible responsibility of being on top of the capital markets in the slide. So with that, I'll, Paul, if you could look forward to your presentation here.
Great, thanks, Mark. My role is to bring the investor perspective to this discussion, but I've actually been working in this field my entire career, but I started on the consumer side at a now-defunct nonprofit in New York City called the Council on Economic Priorities back in 1995, about 15 years ago. CEP put out a consumer guidebook called Shopping for a Better World that did much of what a good guide now does, providing specific ratings on products like toothpaste, which allowed consumers to make a choice based on issues important to them, whether it was the environment or diversity or animal welfare. At that time, I actually moved over into the investing side because I thought that the investing side had a little bit more momentum. I thought there was a growing investor voice in making decisions based on social and environmental performance criteria. There was really an emerging field of SRI at that time, and I'm very pleased to see that over the last 15 years, SRI has now grown into a major mainstream investment movement. So let me back up and define SRI. SRI actually stands for Socially Responsible Investment. And at its most basic level, it simply means considering environmental, social, and governance factors as part of your overall investment decision-making process. Now, of course, SRI is known by many other terms. Some folks call it sustainable investments. Some folks call it responsible investments. The popular term of art right now is ESG investments, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. And also popular right now is the term green investing, and there's really a lot of overlap between green investing and the field of SRI. SRI really originated with investors that were interested in aligning their values with their investments. But now it's included many more mainstream investors who simply view this as a good way to invest because it helps you identify companies better positioned for long-term sustainable performance. Because honestly, these companies that pay attention to these issues have better quality management, and they're really better at managing emerging risks. We've seen a tremendous amount of growth in the field of SRI. In fact, just over the 15 years that I mentioned. If you look right now, according to the Social Investment Forum in 2007, 1 out of every $9 in the U.S. is invested in some type of socially responsible investment. And that includes not only screening out companies that might not meet certain criteria, but also the process of shareholder advocacy or using your position as an owner in a company to push a company to improve. SRI assets rose more than 324% over those 15 years, from $639 billion in 1995 to about $2.71 trillion in 2007. If you look just at the number of SRI mutual funds, we've seen a growth in that time from 55 mutual funds to 260. Now, I work at Calvert, and that's a mutual fund company based right outside of Washington, D.C. in the U.S. We've got about $14 billion in assets under management. And all of our stock products, our equity products, examine corporate performance in 7 key environmental and social issue areas. And they include the environment, community relations, workplace, indigenous people's rights, human rights, product safety, and corporate governance and ethics. In fact, the company's got to meet our minimum criteria in each of those issue areas to be eligible for investment. Now, given the size of Calvert, our opinion on corporate performance really matters. And we often have large companies coming to us and pushing us to consider their name, trying to make the case for how they've improved so we might consider them. We also use our power as shareholders to push companies to improve through shareholder advocacy. Now, really, much of the growth in socially responsible investing can be tied to major institutions that are starting to get involved in this space. In fact, there's an initiative called the Principles for Responsible Investment that now represents over 400 international investors with $18 trillion in assets under management. Now, these are big investors like major pension funds, whether it's CalPERS, CalSTRS, the State of New York, the City of New York, State of Maryland, big money behind this initiative. And I think that the reason why we've seen so much interest really is because we've broken through 2 primary myths that I want to talk about. The first myth about SRI is that choosing SRI is inconsistent with fiduciary responsibilities. And as many of you may know, if you're a fiduciary, you have a relationship of trust to investors, and you need to manage that relationship well. And some folks simply thought that if you consider issues outside of just financial performance, you'd be breaking that relationship of trust. Well, there's been a few different studies that have come out to show that, in fact, not only are you not breaching that responsibility, but you might actually be required to consider environmental, social, and governance factors when you make investment decisions on behalf of a client. And in fact, there was a UN study that you can find at www.unepfi, that's UNEPFI.org, called the Freshfield Study that looked at fiduciary law in 9 different countries. And you'll see the quote here. Across all those countries, they found a common factor. They say the links between ESG factors and financial performance are increasingly being recognized. On that basis, integrating ESG considerations in an investment analysis so as to more reliably predict financial performance is clearly permissible, and this is the punchline right here, is arguably required in all jurisdictions. So that first myth we're able to cast aside. Well, the second myth is this, that by doing socially responsible investments, you're actually causing worse performance, that somehow you give up performance by restricting an investment universe or by pursuing this kind of strategy. And this one we've also broken through, in part because so many of the SRI products have had very strong performance over the last few years, even in the midst of the financial crisis, but also with academic research that's backed up a link between ESG performance and financial performance. There's a number of different studies. I'm just going to mention 2 briefly. One was a review in the Journal of Investing that showed pretty conclusively that there's no performance cost to SRI on a risk-adjusted basis. And in fact, with 3 specific areas, we see a positive connection with these specific metrics and either financial performance or stock price, because they're actually different things. The 3 areas, not surprisingly, are the environment, which is much of the discussion today, also workplace issues and corporate governance issues. If a company gets these things right, it goes directly to the bottom line. This particular study looked at other studies, including Moskowitz Prize winners. That's an annual industry award given for the top academic paper on SRI. The other report that's not listed here on the slide that I just want to mention briefly is another UNEP report called Demystifying Responsible Investment Performance. That can also be found on the UNEPFI website at www.unepfi.org. And this particular study looked at academic research as well as sell-side brokerage studies directly from Wall Street that showed connections between issues like water, climate change, and workplace issues with financial performance. So that's actually backed up by the UN and a major investment consultant by the name of Mercer. So I just want to spend 1 more minute on probably what is the most compelling specific case that shows this connection, and that is the case of climate change. Now, there's many different environmental and social issues that have very clear material impacts on corporate financial performance, but probably no single case makes that case better than the issue of climate change. And in fact, we see this quote from Mercer Investment Consulting that says, climate change has the potential to affect companies, industries, and whole economies, making it one of the most financially significant environmental issues facing investors today. And it's very interesting to me as I've followed companies over the last 15 years to see that in the old days, they really felt bothered by shareholders and stakeholders that were asking questions about these issues. Now, especially on the issue of climate change, they feel it's very important to be proactive in how they talk about this issue, providing information in their annual reports or in corporate sustainability reports with how they're actively managing the risk related to this particular issue. And if you think about the risks, it really is wide-ranging. It could be regulatory risks, such as the cost of new climate change legislation, whether it's national or international agreements, very real risks from physical impacts. Imagine if you're an oil company and you have a rig in the Gulf of Mexico and they're seeing very much more severe storm activity in the Gulf that's damaging your physical assets. Also insurance to cover those types of plants that you might have on the coastline that are also more exposed to storms. And of course, there's the issue of reputational risk, which I think at the end of the day is also one that makes sense not only from the financial side, but also from the consumer side. A company's reputational risk is the single most important thing that it owns, and in some cases makes up a very large part of the company's overall stock price. So with that, let me just stop and answer any questions that Mark might have first.